The first story we have today, this evening, this morning, or whatever time of night or day it happens to be wherever you are, comes from the BBC. It was published on the 1st of February 2019 by Yolanda Knell, or Knell. Yolanda Knell, maybe. I'm not sure. No. U.S. stops all aid to Palestinians in West Bank and Gaza. U.S. has confirmed it stopped all aid to Palestinians in the occupied West Bank and Gaza in a step linked to new anti-terrorism legislation. More than $60 million, or 46 million pounds, in annual funds for the Palestinian Security Services has now ended, and while Israel has backed some previous cuts in U.S. aid for Palestinians, officials have expressed concern about this move. It is thought that cooperation with Israeli forces, which helps keep relative calm in the West Bank, could be affected. The Anti-Terrorism Classification Act, or ATCA, passed by Congress and then signed into law by President Donald Trump last year, has just come into force. This allows Americans to sue those receiving foreign aid from their country in U.S. courts over alleged complicity in acts of war. At a news conference on Thursday, senior official Saeb Erekat said the Palestinian Authority, or PA, had sent a letter to the U.S. State Department asking them to end funding because of a fear of lawsuits. He said, quote, "We do not want to receive any money if it will cause us to appear before the courts," end quote. The PA denies Israeli accusations that it incites militant attacks. Mr. Erekat went on, quote, "We are not seeking anything. The Americans have made their decision, but we will continue to participate in the fight against terrorism in the region," end quote. So, quite interesting. I mean, it goes on for another, almost 2 pages. The link will be in the video description, or a link to a blog post with the references for this video will be in the video description. At first glance, the article title makes it seem as if, the average person would assume, especially based on the recent decision of the Trump administration to recognize the city of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel and to move the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem from Tel Aviv. As if the U.S. government did this on the basis of some pro-Israel, pro-Zionist, pro-hyper-Zionist kind of perspective. But apparently it was the Palestinian Authority which requested that. It's quite a surprise based on what one might assume. The next article that we have comes to us. Now, this is actually from 2016. It's from August of 2016, but it is perhaps related to current events. This comes from The Guardian. It is from the 17th of August, 2016, and apparently is by staff and agencies. Bolivia opens, quote, anti-imperialist, end quote, military school to counter U.S. foreign policies. Bolivia's President Evo Morales has opened a new anti-imperialist military academy to counter U.S. policies and military influence in Latin America. The country's first indigenous president said at an inauguration ceremony on Wednesday, quote, if the empire teaches domination of the world from its military schools, we will learn from this school to free ourselves from imperial oppression, end quote. He told a crowd that included the defense ministries of Venezuela and Nicaragua, quote, we want to build anti-colonial and anti-capitalist thinking with this school that binds the armed forces to social movements and counteracts the influence of the School of the Americas that always saw the indigenous as internal enemies, end quote. Some Latin American officers trained at the U.S.-based School of the Americas went on to commit atrocities under 20th century military dictatorships. In 2000, the academy at Fort Benning, Georgia, was renamed the Western Hemisphere Institute for Security Cooperation. Yes, it's certainly true that the School of the Americas trained quite a few right-wing dictators who... So anyway, there's a photograph here of the Juan José Torres Anti-Imperialist Commando School in Santa Cruz, Bolivia. So the article goes on a bit longer. Let's see, another page or so. Very interesting. And so, in light of the saber rattling towards Venezuela at the moment, this could be of considerable relevance and interest. Certainly Bolivia and Nicaragua and Cuba and Venezuela seem to be somewhat allied with one another. They all are funding the news agency Telesur, which is based in Venezuela. And until sometime in 2018, Argentina was the second largest source of funds for Telesur. They pulled out for reasons that I'm not entirely sure of. So let's see. And speaking of Venezuela, this article comes from Democracy Now! It was published on the 1st of February 2019, and it says WSJ, Wall Street Journal, after Venezuela, U.S. to target Cuba in an effort to reshape Latin America. The Wall Street Journal is reporting the U.S.-backed effort to oust Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro is just the first step in the Trump administration's plan to reshape Latin America, with Cuba next on its radar. According to the report, the U.S. is planning to announce new measures against Cuba in the coming weeks, including new sanctions and restoring Cuba's designation as a state sponsor of terrorism. The moves could severely hamper foreign investment into the country. According to the Wall Street Journal, the U.S. then plans to target Nicaragua. In November, National Security Advisor John Bolton dubbed the three nations the Troika of Tyranny. Last week, Vice President Mike Pence said that President Trump is, quote, not a fan, end quote, of U.S. interventions abroad, except for in, quote, this hemisphere, end quote. Yeah, that's very disconcerting, to say the least. I thought, I had some hope, actually, that relations between the United States and Cuba were going to begin warming after the death of Fidel Castro. But that, well, we have a Republican in the White House and Republican-led Senate at the moment, so probably kind of still have some of that old McCarthyist, Nixonian kind of Reagan-esque, Bushite attitude towards. There's another article from Democracy Now! Which follows up on this page, and it says Venezuela, Guaido seeks support from Russia and China as Maduro government remains defiant. And well, they should. I mean, Guaido did not run for office in 2018, the election that was held earlier than the government had planned to hold it, because the opposition wanted to hold it that early. And then 3 of the opposition parties decided they were going to boycott the election, which they had called for. One of those was the party of Guaido. So Guaido hasn't run for an office, and it's a bit odd to see how Mike Pence and these other folk in the administration are so eagerly anointing Guaido as the legitimate, so-called legitimate president of Venezuela. Maduro won by over 60% in the election. There were other parties, several other parties took part in the election. There are some other articles there that you might find interesting. And again, all of these will be, all the links for the references to the articles I have been reading and commenting on will be available to you either in the video description, or if that should prove to be more than YouTube can handle due to its character limits, then it will be a link to a blog post in the video description, and the blog post will have the full video description, which would be too long for YouTube. The next article comes to us from CNN, of all places. This is published on the 1st of February. Also, it's by Nicole Gauete and Jennifer Hansler. Pompeo announces suspension of nuclear arms treaty with Russia. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo announced Friday that the U.S. is suspending the Intermediate-Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, a key pact with Russia that has been a centerpiece of European security since the Cold War. Pompeo said, speaking from the State Department, quote, "For years, Russia has violated the terms of the Intermediate-Range Nuclear Forces Treaty without remorse. Russia's violations put millions of Europeans and Americans at greater risk," end quote. He said, adding that the U.S. had provided ample time for Russia to return to compliance, quote, "It is our duty to respond appropriately," end quote. The long-expected suspension, which has raised concerns about a renewed arms race with Moscow and put European allies on edge, goes into effect on Saturday. That would have been yesterday, as I'm recording this, and 2 days ago, as you'll be seeing it probably. Again, I might release this sometime tonight, a little after midnight, if I have it all ready in time. Pompeo's announcement starts a 180-day clock to complete withdrawal unless Russia returns to compliance with the 1987 agreement. President Donald Trump and his senior officials had been signaling for months that they were ready to pull out of the INF treaty, which the U.S. accuses Moscow of violating since 2014. So, and this article goes on a bit longer. Now, I know that some of my subscribers are too young to remember the Cold War. I am not. The year I graduated high school and started university, the album War came out, U2 album War, on which there was a song called Seconds. It was about the possibility of nuclear annihilation, basically. We had, back in those days, what was called mutually assured destruction. It was a policy that sort of governed the West and the East attitude toward one another. Mutually assured destruction, you may note, if you be astute or have seen it referenced elsewhere, the letters formed the acronym MAD, M-A-D, and it was quite a mad policy. It was essentially, if you launch a first strike, we're going to destroy you. So, I mean, you may kill us, but we're going to kill all you as well. This is just insanity. And so we lived with that over our heads. I can recall, as a young child in elementary school, there were occasional drills to what we were supposed to do in the event of a nuclear war, which amounted to getting under your desk and I don't recall anything about putting your head between your knees, but there was an old, supposedly this used to happen in the 50s, I guess. You would get under your desk and put your head between your knees, and the joke then went, and kiss your ass goodbye, because that was it. And I'm quite, looking back on it now, I'm quite surprised that growing up where I did, that we didn't have any kind of fallout shelter, because, I mean, and, certainly it would have been a prime target if such a thing had ever been attempted. Fortunately, it was not, but there you go. It was also in the, well, I guess it would have been in the mid-70s, I guess, the first sort of manifestation of Gothic subculture came into existence, and this would have been in Europe, I guess, at the time. Some of that would have probably been considered proto-goth culture, because it didn't really have the name yet, to my knowledge. I think the name came about in the late 70s. By the 80s, or certainly by the 90s, it had made its way to the United States. I recall there was an issue of Playboy that came out in about 1987, if I recall correctly. It was sometime between 87 and 91. Anyway, that had an article about the Gothic subculture, which, by that point in time had the name Gothic, where the proto-goths, of which I consider myself one, because, I had a life-size poster of Bela Lugosi as Dracula on my wall before Bauhaus was even a band. So, I mean, Bauhaus is considered to be a proto-Gothic band. Proto-Goths existed before there was a name for this kind of subculture, and we weren't really a subculture. We were just the weirdos. We were the kids who liked the old vampire movies and stuff like that, and Dark Shadows, the original soap opera, Dark Shadows, and read a lot of Gothic literature and poetry, like Edgar Allan Poe and Nathaniel Hawthorne and so forth. But there was, in this article, an attempt to connect this Gothic subculture with the sort of morbidity of living in the Cold War, the possibility that, it could be just seconds, and many people wouldn't even know what hit them before we were all gone. It's not something that I would like to see return, and I don't think anyone remotely sane would like to see it return. The next article that I have to present to you this evening and to comment upon comes from Common Dreams, and let's see, it was published on the 1st of February, like so many other of the articles I've been reading tonight. This is called "With Nothing Less Than the Fate of the Internet at Stake, a federal court told why FCC's attack on net neutrality so dangerous." I don't see an author's name. Advocates of net neutrality had their eyes on a federal court on Friday, where the showdown over the Federal Communications Commission's, or FCC's, repeal of the Obama-era open internet protections continued. At the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia, oral arguments in Mozilla versus FCC were heard. In that suit, which The Verge frames as, quote, one of the most important cases in internet law history, end quote, technology and advocacy groups joined by over 20 state attorneys general challenge the FCC's 2017 gutting of net neutrality. Matt Wood, policy director at Free Press, said, quote, the appeals court judges today heard in full detail just how awful a job the Trump FCC did, end quote. While the case covered complex issues, said FCC Commissioner Jessica Rosenworcel, who voiced opposition to the repeal of net neutrality, one thing is quite clear. She said, quote, "The court now has a chance to right what the FCC got wrong when it made the misguided decision to roll back net neutrality. I sat through it all. I'm hopeful," end quote. Yeah, I remember Jessica Rosenworcel. She was one of the, I guess, two voices on the FCC who opposed the decision of the other three. And I did retweet some of her tweets at the time, leading up to and immediately after. As observers noted, the hearing drew out some interesting admissions from the FCC. This is a tweet from Tim Carr. "If you didn't catch that, the FCC lawyer just admitted that paid prioritization creates fast lanes and slow lanes. His phone and cable industry coaches have been reluctant to admit as much," end quote. Ernesto Falcon tweeted, "The FCC admitted that an ISP is allowed to throttle Netflix, prioritize Hulu, and it's all legal so long as they tell us they are doing it. Neither the FCC nor the FTC could stop that arrangement," end quote. Yet, as The Verge reports, quote, "There was no immediate sign of which way the three-judge panel overseeing the case would decide," end quote. According to the petitioners, the reporting continues. The article continues for another page and a little more than a page. So, yeah, by all means, check that out later. The FCC buggered up the internet. My ISP has been playing some dirty tricks on me, and I am hopeful to get out of here eventually, hopefully sooner rather than later, and back where I belong, where the weather suits my clothes, as the song says. And interestingly enough, and somewhat related to this, the next article that we have is, this comes from TruthDig. It was published on the 31st of January, 2019. It's by Joel Whitney. "The CIA's masterful use of fake news." Well, yeah, I mean, if we've got no net neutrality, no freedom of information kind of thing going on, I mean, the internet was supposed to be a free speech thing. It was supposed to be a place where we could, not be subjected to the diktats of our various governments and their overly draconian attempts to control the flow of information and so forth. And then, of course, we had the law approval by the two houses of Congress and signed into law by President Barack Obama, basically sort of a ministry of propaganda, sort of ministry of truth established. Anyway. Also, I think it was another law that made it possible, made it legal now for the USIC, the United States Intelligence Community, to use propaganda on the people of the United States, our own citizens being propagandized by our intelligence communities. Now, these, let me remind you, these are the intelligence communities which gave us what they claim was faulty information, flawed intelligence, intelligence mistakes, blah, blah, blah. Well, were they mistakes, were they faulty, or were they just out-and-out lies that they knew were not true from the beginning? That's a question which remains to be answered and really should be answered, but I don't know. Anyway, so let me dive into this article. In early 1954, writing in the magazine Encounter, E.R. Aleman slammed the ex-Prime Minister of Iran, Mohammad Mossadegh, for alleged abuses. In a letter from Tehran titled Persia, Land of Unrealities, Aleman referred to Mossadegh's aborted term as a, quote, pseudo-revolutionary, pseudo-dictatorship, end quote, and claimed Mossadegh could only cram laws through Iran's parliament by summoning things to street protests, that is, through demagoguery. People familiar with this channel, people who've been watching for a while, may recall a live stream that I did some time back that was called TP Ajax. I think that was it. Project TP Ajax was the CIA coup that deposed Mohammad Mossadegh and replaced him with the Shah. Anyway, I'll continue with the article. Now, there was nothing about that operation or Mossadegh or the CIA or anything in that stream. That was just a lot of the streams that I have done on Friday nights have been given sort of, I don't know if I would really call them humorous titles. In some cases, of course, like A Magic Bullet Ride, A Party on the Grassy Knoll, Lee Harvey Oswald did 9/11. Certainly they're meant to be somewhat tongue-in-cheek. But of course, now that YouTube is going to be clamping down on what it says are conspiracy channels, I'm a little concerned because one of those streams has the little Wikipedia article link on it about the JFK assassination, and I'm like, there's nothing about the JFK assassination in this video at all. I'm not talking about any conspiracy theories. Anyway, so I may have to stop giving my. I was just giving my my streams kind of odd, quirky titles like Watergate Plumbers Incorporated. The Watergate Plumbers were the boys that worked for Nixon that went and broke into the Watergate office building and got into the Democratic headquarters there, Democratic Party headquarters, and planted listening devices and recorded from across the street at the Howard Johnsons. That was what was Watergate. Everyone talks about Watergate. Well, Watergate is a hotel, but it's also an office complex in Washington, D.C. And so the Watergate Hotel / office complex, that's what that was about. And, it was just kind of we didn't talk about Watergate. It was just myself and some people from my subscribers who were hanging out and talking about this, that, and the other, and nothing about Watergate came up as far as I can recall. It wasn't a subject that was planned to be talked about, and I don't believe we did. I've given CIA code names and such to a variety of other streams that I've done, and not talked about anything in connection with those titles. There was, for example, let's see, there was one, what was it called? PB Jointly and the Gold Pocket Watch, I think, was the title of one of them, and it was about there was a joint operation between the CIA and MI6 that was building tunnels under the Berlin Wall back in the, we were just talking about the Cold War. So anyway, I don't want to get off too far off of the current articles here. So let me get back into this. It was the same thing that happened with the stream that I did that was called Operation Midnight Climax a while back. That one was myself, another leftist, and 3 or 4 right-wingers discussing economic systems. So we talked about, capitalism, corporatism, communism, other forms of socialism, social democracy, and so on. And I think there might have even been a little bit of discussion of MMT in that. But there was nothing at all about Operation Midnight Climax. It was a fairly interesting discussion about economic systems between people who did not agree, and for the most part we managed to be relatively civil, except for one guy who became increasingly intoxicated as the stream went on, and eventually when he started slurring his words I had to mute him because he had become rather obnoxious by that point in time as well. So, let me get back into this article, sorry. Alleman depicted Mossadegh's rallies as, quote, terror campaigns of the political religious secret societies, end quote, whose vocal support gave only the impression of a genuine mass movement, lest the London-based magazine's white European leadership miss these subtle cues to revile the out-of-office politician, Aleman, a Swiss journalist, offered his readers a buffet of Orientalist buzzwords. Rather than a rational leader elected by his people, Mossadegh was instead a charismatic, quote, dervish, end quote, and, quote, nobody was more inclined toward Munchausen escapades like those of Mossadegh's incumbency than the Oriental in general and the Persian in particular, end quote. Decades later, one must ask, where were Encounter's fact-checkers? Contrary to the article, Mossadegh was legally elected during a period of robust Iranian democracy, and he was known as a beloved leader and a fiery speaker. His was such an iconic voice for his people that he was voted Time magazine's Man of the Year after being named Prime Minister. It was strange that such venom as Aleman's should describe a popular Democrat once praised by President Harry Truman. Was Aleman signaling some conflict between the respective interests of Mossadegh and Encounter? In fact, the magazine's name signaled an East-West encounter. It was intended to give its readers and its editors and readers wide cultural reach from London and Western Europe all the way to Africa, India, and East Asia. But what motive might Aleman have had to blame the out-of-office Mossadegh for the nation's current problems? Mossadegh was removed from office in an infamous 1953 coup that restored Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi to the throne, leaving the Shah's allies in key posts and Mossadegh incarcerated and then condemned to house arrest. Soon after the restoration of the Shah to the throne, the CIA sent a U.S. Army colonel to build the organization that would become the infamous Savak, a secret police service that could censor, blacklist, torture, and arrest Iranian citizens without due process. A lot of this sounds very familiar, doesn't it? I mean, talking about Maduro, the claim that the election was rigged, that it was some kind of illegitimate election, that the pretender, as I shall call him, Guaido, is somehow the legitimate head of the Venezuelan government, when the dude didn't even run for any office, and his entire party boycotted the election. They were free to take part in the election. If it had been a rigged election, why would Maduro only get, what was 65% or so of the vote? Because if it were a rigged election, it would be something more like 95% of the vote, right? Right? And then we got people here in the United States that are so ignorant about our own electoral system that they're pointing out things like, well, that was only like 1/5 of the Venezuelan people who elected him. It's not a legitimate government. I beg to differ, dear sirs and ladies. Here's what happens. Let me just give you an example here. Now, 2016, okay? We had a voter turnout that was a little more than 50% of registered voters. Now, registered voters are not the totality of eligible voters. Not everyone who is eligible to vote is registered to vote, because some people just don't see any point to it. They either believe that their vote doesn't count, or they believe that it doesn't matter who they vote for, we're going to get the same crap anyway, which has certainly been true for the past 40 years. Democrat, Republican, doesn't matter. Same neoliberal economic policies, same neoconservative foreign policies, more or less the same authoritarian domestic policies. There's a little bit of difference, as I've said several times, as to what specific aspects of our lives they wish to dictate. But apart from that, which is basically just minor variation on the same policy, there's no substantial difference between the two parties at all, and there hasn't been in quite some time. Certainly for 25 years or more. And so, I mean, there are other people who just, they don't want to have to be faced with the possibility of jury duty. If you vote in the United States, if you're registered to vote and you do actually vote, then you can be summoned to jury duty. And, this is your civic duty and so forth. There are some ways to get out of it, but you still have to show up there at some ungodly hour in the morning. There are a number of other reasons why people might not be registered to vote. The majority of eligible voters are registered to vote, but it's not like anything like 90%. I think it's more like 70%. I don't know. I'd have to check again because these change. The percentage of eligible voters who are registered to vote changes from year to year, and sometimes more frequently than that. Certainly every time someone comes of age, they go register or refrain from doing so. But anyway, the point I'm making with this is, let's say we have, just shot in the dark, 80% of eligible voters are registered to vote. And I don't think it's anywhere near that high. I think it's more like 67% or something the last time I can recall looking. And I may not be remembering exactly right, but anyway, I may not be remembering exactly right, but anyway, more than half of eligible voters are registered to vote, but certainly not 90%. So let's just go ahead and say that 80% are registered to vote. A little more than half of the, roughly half, a little more than half, turn out to vote in any given presidential, every 4-year election. And then you get your midterms, and there's a little bit less who typically turn out to vote. So what we're talking about then is like 40%, roughly, maybe a little more, of eligible voters that are actually showing up to vote. Now, let's divide that by 2, because that's roughly how it goes. And has been for quite a while. We've been hitting voting for president roughly divides right down the middle of those who vote, with about half of them choosing the Democratic candidate and about half of them choosing the Republican candidate, and then a marginal percentage going for Libertarian or Green Party candidate. Unfortunately, marginal number, because like I said, the two main parties are completely indistinguishable, except in terms of rhetoric and posturing. As far as what they actually do, as Machiavelli said, the great majority of humanity are led astray by appearances as though they were realities, and more often moved by things which seem than by things which are. So you've got these people who say, X, Y, and Z, but they do A, B, and C instead. So we have roughly half of about 40% of eligible voters voting for either the Republican or the Democrat. A little bit less than that, maybe a little bit more, depending on exactly, how many people turn out. Sometimes we get as much as 57% of registered voters who turn out to vote in a presidential election, and sometimes we get as low as 53%. And so what we're saying here then is that if we're getting about half of registered voters, and if 80% of eligible voters are registered, that would be about 40% of eligible voters turning out to vote. Now, divide that in half, and you get 20%. Guess what 20% is? 1/5 of eligible voters. So people that are pissing and moaning about how Maduro was elected by 1/5 of the people of Venezuela, hey, that's how many people voted for Hillary. That's how many people voted for Trump in America. 1/5, roughly. And Jill Stein got 1.9% of the vote, and Gary Johnson got, I don't know, what did he get? 3%, maybe less. Point being, roughly 1/5 of eligible voters in the United States, maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less, selected either Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton. Donald Trump won. Oh, but he didn't win the popular vote. It doesn't matter. Hillary still only got roughly the same amount in terms of percentage, and if you want to take it in terms of fifths, yeah, she got about 1/5, which is about what Trump got. You know? So, how illegitimate is Maduro? Well, how illegitimate is Trump? How illegitimate would Hillary have been, with only 1/5 of eligible voters supporting either one of them? Come on, guys. Pull your heads out of your asses and pay attention to what's really going on. You know, Venezuela has oil. You know, Venezuela has coltan, that mineral that's used. I mean, I think I talked about this last week's show. So go back and watch that later if you haven't seen it already. Anyway, I'm going to go on. From this standpoint, Aleman's letter from Tehran comes into focus. It appeared in Encounter more than a decade before the magazine was exposed as a CIA and British intelligence asset, though there were rumors throughout its existence that it had ties to Western intelligence through its parent organization, the Congress for Cultural Freedom. When exposure came, a battery of solemn liberal intellectuals lined up to attest to the fact that even if secret CIA subsidies had been necessary, Encounter, like the other highbrow CIA magazines, nevertheless did three things. First, it published great writers and writing. Second, it never censored. Third, the funding of intellectual work came, as its defenders insisted, with no strings. Although the first claim was true, as a perusal of the table of contents will show, what about the second and third? When it came to writers whose names had been tied to Encounter and the CIA's Cultural Front, would they even know if editors had quietly censored views their bosses considered beyond the pale? And wouldn't their bias in favor of the magazine's excellence result from the very fact of their legacies now being tied to that presumed excellence? Strings indeed. As relations between the U.S. and Iran again take on a hostile tone, it's worth untangling the intricate braid of CIA claims and secret operations that knocked down rivals and labeled leftists and reformers in the U.S. and around the world as communists. The agency did this so that it could discredit, dehumanize, scare, oust, and in some cases kill America's perceived enemies in swift acts of force bolstered by bribes, blackmail, whisper campaigns, mass propaganda, and, as we see in the case of Aleman, subtle acts of erasure in sophisticated intellectual magazines like Encounter. In fact, all these decades later, impulses to falsify the cultural CIA's record remain lazily de rigueur. In the story of the Iran coup, as told in the West, the name Kashani is not usually mentioned, but in fact, Ayatollah Sayyid Abul Qasim Kashani best signals how, as Robert Dreyfus details in Devil's Game, quote, the very same cleric-led right-wing Islamists that toppled the Shah in 1979 were paid by the CIA in 1953 to support him, end quote. It all got started when Kashani and Mossadegh were united in the belief that Iranian oil profits should go not to the United Kingdom, but, shockingly, to Iranians. This was a fairly common view emerging among developing nations in the wake of World War II. They wanted Western powers to respect their sovereignty and leave them their resources. Mossadegh had been elected to parliament quite young, pre-Pahlavi, and re-elected in 1944, and had been associated with the Qajar dynasty. Though this created occasional bad blood between him and the Pahlavi Shahs, Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi appointed Mossadegh prime minister in 1951 when the Shah's previous appointee, General Ali Razmara, was assassinated. Both Mossadegh and the Shah were modernizers, and even the Shah favored nationalization, sovereignty, and independence, at least until the CIA made him an offer he was not permitted to refuse. As Prime Minister, Mossadegh was chairman of the Parliament's Oil Commission and had created a coalition movement called the National Front. The National Front included a patchwork of Iranian nationalists, including members of the ulema, who favored a modern, independent, and Islamic state. The nationalist impulses of these conservative ayatollahs embraced the front's nationalization of the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, also known as the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, and later British Petroleum. Though there was some division, these members of the country's conservative believers despised the Shah's infringement on their religious rights, while an added nationalism kept many of them in the coalition. As the story of the coup is usually recounted, the British complained to the Americans about losing their oil monopoly, and American Democrats defended Mossadegh, but when the Prime Minister wouldn't promise the Americans their own concessions, Truman abandoned him. In came the Republicans under President Eisenhower. The British convinced the Eisenhower administration that Mossadegh was as good as a communist, and that his nationalization might send a message of American weakness to Soviet and international onlookers. The Americans bought into the plot. The first step was to win over the Shah, who annulled Mossadegh's rule in a royal decree. When this led to chaos, the Shah fled to Italy and was only convinced to resume his involvement through bribes and bullying by the CIA. One iconic visual for this is the infamous mink coat which the CIA dangled before the Shah's twin sister to induce her to cajole her brother to sign on to the coup after its initial failure had made him squeamish. The next move was to pry apart Mossadegh's coalition, united around nationalization of territory and resources. This meant peeling off the mullahs from that coalition and justifying U.S. actions in the media. A secret marriage was consecrated between Western policymakers and the ayatollahs of the ulema, who were bribed to summon crowds against the legitimate government of Mossadegh in order to bring it down. A marriage of convenience less than love, it would return in the annals of the CIA's cultural Cold War in contested places like Afghanistan, not to mention 1979 Iran. The marriage between Western intelligence and ayatollahs gave rise, then, to exactly the sort of, quote, terror campaigns of the political religious secret societies, end quote, that Encounter falsely blamed on Mossadegh, but before Encounter was enlisted to do post-coup cleanup, the plotters tapped journalist Kenneth Love to do so in real time. In his New York Times obituary, Love was remembered for his role in the coup. Quote, Mr. Love's reporting in the Times may have played a small part in the 1953 coup, end quote, the obituary writer gently conceded. Quote, he and a reporter for the Associated Press wrote about decrees signed by the Shah that called for General Zahedi to replace Mr. Mossadegh. The release of the decrees which helped legitimize the coup was engineered by the CIA, though Mr. Love insisted later that he had been unaware of the agency's involvement, end quote. But how did the Americans win over the Ayatollahs? In the same way that the British had, by purchasing their loyalty through bribes. Bribed frequently by the British, the Ayatollahs had even been teased by the Shah's sister, who wrote in her memoir that if you lifted one of their beards, you'd see stamped on their necks the phrase, Made in England. Funding and collaborating with hardliners who would become the agency's future adversaries was one link in a long chain of CIA blunders. Indeed, a long chain of CIA blunders. Although, as blunder or intentional. We may never know. We may never know. Curiouser and curiouser. In fact, the same Ayatollah Khomeini, who later overthrew the Shah and thereby jettisoned so-called American interests, used the very method the Americans had used, learned via his teacher and spiritual godfather Kashani, Throngs of zealous mobs flooding the streets aligned against Mossadegh as encounters, quote, terror campaigns of the political religious secret societies, end quote. But Alemann's revision of the facts, on the record but little noted for decades, raises important questions about the CIA's respected intellectual magazines. If the magazines were run with no strings, how did the CIA keep leftists, America's critics, and others out of their pages? As an agency created to prosecute the Cold War, how did the CIA justify the outlay of money for culture without regularly engaging in disinformation, or what one critic called Encounter's, quote, paranoiac throb of genuine propaganda, end quote? In her landmark History of Encounter, which ceased publication in 1991, and the other CIA magazines as part of the greater cultural Cold War, Frances Stoner Saunders found that some of Encounter's creators were also plotters of the Iran coup, such as Christopher Montague Woodhouse, who in some cases wrote for the magazine. In Who Paid the Piper, she notes further that the tale of the magazine never censoring was itself a myth contradicted in its editorial archives. In researching my book, Finks, How the CIA Tricked the World's Best Writers, I found the same official censorship at work in the archives of such magazines for the developing world as Combate and Cuadernos para la Libertad de la Cultura, both for Latin America. The CIA's lauded intellectual magazines indeed routinely censored, a censorship explicitly built into the editor's marching orders. No small thing to find in an archive, a confession. Saunders further cited the occasional example of Encounter's trolling, apologetics, or misinforming on behalf of Western geostrategic interests. But Who Paid the Piper is better on the omission of censored articles than on these commissions, cases in which the magazines misinformed their readers, likely deliberately. Used selectively lest it draw too much attention, this disinformation appears consistently in the magazine's archives, presumably published to erase what really happened during the agency's coups, ballot stuffing, and other penetrations of countries far and near. Some examples follow. And then it goes into the article, then proceeds to go into talking about the coup in Guatemala, the U.S. and desegregation. This was, this one is always very interesting. See, COINTELPRO was an FBI program, counterintelligence program. COINTELPRO, counter, intel, intelligence, program. COINTELPRO was an FBI counterintelligence program that involved infiltration of the hippie movement, the anti-war movement, the civil rights movement, the Black Panthers, several, the Students for Democratic Society, I think it was called. That was kind of a leftist kind of group of university students at the time. In the 60s, and maybe still in the early 70s, I'm not sure. Anyway, so they would infiltrate, and they would kind of attempt to stir strife and division and dissension. They would smear, engage in character assassination of some of the more respected members of these groups, and kind of tear them down so that they would no longer be respected, undermining their influence, essentially. There certainly was a letter sent from the FBI to Dr. King, Martin Luther King Jr., telling him that they knew about his extramarital affairs and telling him he should kill himself. About a month before he was killed. There certainly was U.S. intelligence shenanigans going on from 1958 on through the entire civil rights movement, with the USIC trying to undermine efforts to desegregate and bring civil rights and equality to African Americans. And we talk about Chile, of course. Now I've hinted at this before, and I think I even may have said something about this. The CIA overthrew the leftist president Salvador Allende in Chile in 1973 and replaced him, or saw to it that he was replaced by Augusto Pinochet, who has been called both the last fascist and the first neoliberal. Fascism and neoliberalism, as I've said many times, and they're siblings. They're both types of corporatism. They're both extreme right-wing economic policy perspective. And so they have quite a lot in common, quite a lot. And the only real substantial difference is in who retains the upper hand in this union or collusion between the state and corporate power. So in fascism, the state retains the upper hand, corporate interests are made to serve the interests of the state. In neoliberalism, it's the opposite. The state becomes the servant of corporate interests. And I mean, you can listen to almost any of my videos or streams over the past year and a half or so, however long. I guess it's getting close to 2 years now that I've had this channel. So, yeah. If you listen to anything on this channel from the time it started until now, there's a pretty good chance you're going to hear me explain this, because I tend to talk about it fairly often, and my boyfriend gets annoyed at the fact that I repeat myself so often. Well, just make a damn video, he says, and talk about it there, and then you can just refer them to that. And maybe I will eventually, but I kind of like to keep working on it in my head and putting it on paper or screen, as the case may be, until I get it refined to a point that I think it's something that I can. Anyway, so Chile is another example. No, the thing about that was there are a lot of people who can't discern between neoliberalism and fascism. So you'll find people referring to neoliberals as fascists, and yeah, they're very, very, very similar, and they both are horrible, horrible things, neoliberalism and fascism, but they're not quite identical. And I mean, this may be a sort of splitting hairs kind of thing to say, well, they're both horrible, but they're not quite the same. Okay, but they're both horrible. Okay, granted, they are both horrible, but I like to use terms properly, and it's important to do so. And I've made quite a number of, I've bitched about this quite a lot, people misusing terminology and misusing words. Okay, Indonesia is another example given in the article. Let's see, this is actually quite a long article. I've read quite a lot of it already, and okay. So, and Indonesia is apparently the last example that it gives, but it does have a sort of there is a conclusion here that I wanted to kind of look at. This year marks the 40th anniversary of the start of the 1979 Iran hostage crisis, which grew out of the Iranian Revolution. I remember this only too well. I remember there was a song, in fact, that was released by one of these kind of country or country-ish musicians, and it was kind of an attempt to poke fun at the Ayatollah Khomeini. And it was all about, the hostages that were taken in 1979. Anyway, pictures from the protest show signs in English that say the quote Shah is a U.S. puppet, down with the Shah, end quote, reminding us how the Shah returned to power in the first place. One former participant described the revolution as a conscious response to the CIA's 1953 coup, but the lessons from all these decades of bellicosity against the Islamic Republic appear to have been lost on Democrats as well as Republicans. Not only were the actions themselves a kind of operational blowback, the New York Times noted that the propaganda could be exposed abroad while being believed in the United States. Officers who created the propaganda, quote, said they had been concerned about, but helpless to avoid, the potential blowback, the possibility that the CIA propaganda, some of it purposely misleading or downright false, might be picked up by American reporters overseas and included in their dispatches to their publications at home, end quote. Evidence suggests this was rampant, if not as passive as those former officers describe. Such covert actions as the 1953 coup, the 1954 coup, the Bay of Pigs, the Indonesian coups, the Vietnam War, and countless others tended to start and close with propaganda that was effectively fake news. In the beginning is a monster we must overthrow. In the end, anything questioning our motives or our results must be written off to operational mishaps or falsified outright. This was the case even when the propaganda itself was exposed, and if even sophisticated magazines aimed at the liberal non-communist elite got so much of the history wrong, no wonder Americans are confused about our role in the world. No wonder intellectuals have so often played the role of cheerleaders for U.S. interventions. Clearly, Barack Obama's Iran deal was better than what Donald Trump has already done and may yet do. Most recently, National Security Advisor John Bolton secretly asked the military for plans for an invasion. But if Trump's hawkishness is the problem in Iran, as is the spirit embodied by the pushback to it, and rightly so, why was there so little protest among liberals over Obama's interventions in South and Central Asian countries where alleged radicals were droned regularly, or over his escalations and surges in Yemen, Afghanistan, Honduras, and elsewhere? In fact, it was under the Obama administration that a defense authorization bill passed that rescinded the decades-old ban on domestic propaganda, resulting in the 2016 election being the first since before the Cold War when propaganda by American officials aimed at American audiences was legal. Was this why the 2016 election, with its fake cries over fake news on the right by the latest Fox News president, and with the wide circulation and whispering over intelligence ops like the Steele dossier among Democrats, felt so unprecedented? Not unprecedented overseas, where we made its equivalent happen many times over, but here the answers may be at least partly illuminated by articles in Encounter, where, in tandem with their more hawkish and blatant conservative collaborators, liberals too learned to lie for the cause. Okay, so our next article comes from The Nation, and it was published on the yesterday, it says, which was the 1st, yeah. Okay, so it was published on the 1st of February 2019. It's by Aaron Mate. Mueller accuses Roger Stone of lying and bullying, but not collusion. All the investigation has shown is that Stone asked for secrets from two people with none to provide. Veteran Republican operative and self-proclaimed dirty trickster, suspected intermediary between the Trump campaign and WikiLeaks, Stone sparked that speculation in August 2016 by publicly claiming to have, quote, back-channel communication, end quote, with WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange, and inside information about Assange's releases of stolen Democratic Party emails. Stone has since retracted his claims, and WikiLeaks has steadfastly denied that it ever associated with him. Special counsel Robert Mueller's new indictment of Stone does not allege otherwise, and gives us more reasons to doubt the innuendo that Stone himself caused. Mueller does not accuse Stone of having any WikiLeaks ties or advanced knowledge of its publications. Instead, He charges Stone with false statements, obstruction, and witness tampering during the House Intelligence Committee's efforts to determine what he actually knew. Stone has pleaded not guilty. Stone allegedly misled the committee about his communications with the far-right conspiracy theorist Jerome Corsi, as well as the leftist radio host and comedian Randy Credico. He is also accused of trying to intimidate Credico into not contradicting his statements. Stone enlisted Corsi and Credico throughout the 2016 campaign to help him discover WikiLeaks' plans and pass messages to Assange. Both Corsi and Credico deny having any secret contacts with WikiLeaks or pre-knowledge of its publications, and Mueller does not refute these claims. Instead, we learned that Credico even implored Stone in text messages to, quote, be honest with FBI, there was no back channel, end quote. Stone responded by threatening Credico and his therapy dog. Mueller does not contradict Credico's claim of no back channel. On the 12th of June, Assange announced that he planned to release, quote, upcoming leaks in relation to Hillary Clinton, end quote. 2 days later, the DNC announced that its servers had been hacked. Mueller strongly suggests that at that point, Stone, quote, informed senior Trump campaign officials, end quote, that he had information about WikiLeaks' material on Clinton after WikiLeaks released the first tranche of DNC emails on July 22nd. Mueller reports that, quote, a senior Trump campaign official was directed to contact Stone about any additional releases and what other damaging information WikiLeaks had regarding the Clinton campaign. Stone thereafter told the Trump campaign about potential future releases of damaging material by WikiLeaks, end quote. This passage has caused the most waves, but if anything, Mueller is showing evidence that the Trump campaign did not have advanced knowledge of WikiLeaks' first email dump. The, quote, senior Trump campaign official, end quote, who contacted Stone to inquire about the stolen Democratic Party material, did so, in Mueller's words, quote, after the July 22nd, 2016 release, end quote. And if Stone was their point of contact for, quote, potential future releases, end quote, after that, then they may have been consulting someone without any inside information. That would explain why Mueller uses the word, quote, potential, end quote, and other qualified language. Mueller says that Stone, quote, might have had, end quote, and, quote, claimed to have learned, end quote, damaging information, but he does not assert that Stone had any actual information from WikiLeaks on its actual future releases. There's no evidence that Stone had anything other than the same public sources as anyone else. Perhaps that is why Stone complained in an October 3rd email to a reporter that the Trump official, Steve Bannon, according to media reports, quote, doesn't call me back, end quote. So the article goes on for another page and a half, and as so often has been the case with the investigation by Mueller and company into the alleged Russian collusion and so forth, it's all a great big nothing burger. Yes, there's, there's corruption and posturing and people being blowhards and so forth, but as far as any actual Russian collusion with the Trump campaign, no evidence so far has come out of these investigations. And so now that I have been going for some time, longer than I had intended to, actually, on the editing process. I'm going to go ahead and cut this maybe a little more than half of it off, and go ahead and render this and upload it. And the remainder of the show will be available sometime later this week. Maybe tomorrow, but don't count on it. So if you've enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and subscribe. Ring the bell icon to be notified of all new content, theoretically. And consider sharing the video on your social media. If you like what I do here on my YouTube channel and or at the Progressive Flame, my Medium publication, please consider becoming my patron through Patreon. The link to my Patreon is in the video description. I have a Discord server for my subscribers, so if you'd like to hop in and have a little more access to me, you can certainly find the link to my Discord server in the video description. And there is a special role for patrons. Have a special patron-only text channel and voice channel, so you could have maybe a little more access to hear me ramble if you are not getting enough of that on my YouTube channel. So until next time, have fun, but stay safe. For Republic News, this is Liviana signing off.